The birth of the United States of America was far more than just the creation of a new country on a map. It was a profound and revolutionary moment that sent ripples across the entire globe, fundamentally altering the course of human history. On this day, June 12, 2025, we can look back and see with clarity how this singular event, born from conflict and high ideals, changed the very way people thought about government, liberty, and the rights of the individual. The American Revolution was not merely a colonial squabble over taxes, it was a grand experiment in self-governance, a bold declaration that ordinary people could rule themselves without the need for kings, queens, or hereditary aristocrats. This idea, so radical at the time, would become a beacon of hope for countless millions in the centuries that followed. The American colonists, a diverse group of farmers, merchants, and artisans, took the powerful ideas of the Enlightenment and decided to put them into practice. Thinkers in Europe had written about liberty, natural rights, and the consent of the governed, but these were largely philosophical concepts, debated in salons and universities. The Americans were the first to attempt to build an entire nation upon these principles. They argued that governments did not grant rights to people, rather people were born with inherent rights that no government could justly take away. This was a complete reversal of the established order, a dramatic challenge to the monarchies of Europe that had ruled for centuries through divine right and inherited power. The world watched, skeptical at first, then astonished, as this fledgling nation took its first steps. Before the American Revolution, the world was dominated by vast European colonial empires. Great Britain, Spain, France, and Portugal had carved up huge portions of the globe, ruling over distant lands and peoples for their own economic benefit. The success of the American colonies in breaking away from the mighty British Empire was a stunning blow to this system. It demonstrated that a determined group of colonists could successfully defy their imperial masters and forge their own destiny. This victory served as a powerful and inspiring example for other colonized peoples around the world. It planted the seed of an idea that colonial rule was not permanent and that independence was an achievable goal for those willing to fight for it. The creation of the United States marked the beginning of the end for the old colonial world order. It set a precedent that would be followed by independence movements in Latin America and later in Africa and Asia. The American experiment in democracy, messy and imperfect as it was, showed that a new kind of nation was possible, one founded not on conquest or dynastic succession, but on the principles of liberty and popular sovereignty. The story of the United States is the story of how a small group of colonies on the edge of a wilderness dared to challenge the greatest power on earth, and in doing so, lit a fire of freedom that would eventually spread across the world, forever changing the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. The roots of the American Revolution were not found in a sudden burst of anger, but in a slow-growing resentment over economic policies that colonists felt were fundamentally unfair. For many years, the relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies was mostly beneficial, but after the costly 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, things began to change. Britain had spent enormous sums of money to defend the colonies and was now deeply in debt. To the British Parliament in London, it seemed perfectly reasonable that the American colonists should help pay for the military protection they received. This led to a series of new taxes and laws that the colonists believed were imposed without any say from their side. One of the biggest sources of conflict was the idea of taxation without representation. The colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, yet Parliament was passing laws that directly affected their livelihoods. The Sugar Act of 1764, for instance, placed new duties on sugar and other goods imported into the colonies. While the tax itself was a burden, the larger principle was what truly agitated the colonists. They believed it was a violation of their rights as Englishmen to be taxed by a government in which they had no voice. This was not just a matter of money, it was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of power and the rights of citizens within the British Empire. Beyond direct taxes, Britain also sought to control colonial trade for its own benefit through a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts. These regulations required that most colonial goods be shipped on British ships, and that certain valuable products like tobacco and sugar could only be sold to England. While these laws had been around for a while, they were now being enforced more strictly. This system, known as mercantilism, was designed to enrich the mother country at the expense of its colonies. For American merchants and farmers, it meant they could not always sell their goods to the highest bidder or buy products from the cheapest source. It created a feeling that the colonies existed only to serve Britain's economic interests. The proclamation of 1763 added yet another layer of frustration for the colonists. After the French and Indian War, Britain gained a vast new territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, to avoid conflicts with Native American tribes and to better control the colonies, the British government issued a proclamation forbidding settlement in these western lands. For the many colonists who were farmers, land speculators, or simply looking for new opportunities, this was a devastating blow. It seemed as though Britain was deliberately holding them back, preventing their natural expansion and economic growth. These economic grievances, unfair taxes, restrictive trade rules, and limits on land, slowly but surely eroded the loyalty many colonists felt toward the mother country. The colonists did not immediately take up arms. Their first response to Britain's new policies was organized, peaceful protest. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, it sparked a firestorm of opposition. This law required that a tax be paid on almost all printed materials, from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards. The tax had to be paid in British currency, not colonial paper money, making it even more burdensome. In response, representatives from 9 colonies gathered in what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They issued a formal declaration stating that only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them, a clear and united statement of their core belief in self-governance. At the same time, more radical forms of protest began to emerge on the streets of colonial cities like Boston and New York. Groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty took the lead in organizing demonstrations and boycotts against British goods. These were not just intellectuals debating political philosophy, they were merchants, craftsmen, and laborers who took direct action. They organized public protests, sometimes hanging or burning effigies of British officials to intimidate tax collectors into resigning. Their boycotts of British imports were remarkably effective, hitting British merchants and manufacturers in their wallets. This combination of formal political opposition and popular street-level action showed that resistance was widespread across different levels of colonial society. The turning point from protest to outright rebellion can be traced to a single dramatic event, the Boston Tea Party. By 1773, tensions were already high due to the Townshend Acts, which taxed goods like glass, paper, and tea. Although most of those taxes were later repealed, the tax on tea remained. To help the struggling British East India Company, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which allowed the company to sell its tea directly to the colonies, making it cheaper than smuggled tea, but still subject to the hated tax. For the colonists, this was a clever trick to get them to accept Parliament's right to tax them. In December 1773, a group of Sons of Liberty, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The British reaction to the Boston Tea Party was swift and severe. Parliament, outraged by what it saw as an act of vandalism and open defiance, passed a series of punitive laws known as the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts. These laws closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, restricted town meetings in Massachusetts, and gave more power to the royally appointed governor. Another law, the Quartering Act, allowed British soldiers to be housed in private homes. Instead of crushing the rebellion, these harsh measures had the opposite effect. They horrified the other colonies who saw them as a threat to their own liberties. The punishment of Boston united the colonies in a way nothing else had before. In response to the Intolerable Acts, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia in September 1774 for the First Continental Congress. This meeting was a monumental step toward unified action. The delegates, including figures like John Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry, were not yet calling for independence, but they were determined to defend their rights as Englishmen. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, affirming their loyalty to the king, but condemning Parliament's recent actions. Most importantly, they called for a complete boycott of all British goods and made plans to meet again the following year if their demands were not met. The Congress sent a clear message to London: the colonies were acting together. The situation in Massachusetts grew increasingly tense. The British military governor, General Thomas Gage, had thousands of troops stationed in Boston. While outside the city, colonial militias, known as Minutemen, were stockpiling weapons and training for a potential conflict. In the early spring of 1775, General Gage received orders from London to take decisive action to disarm the colonial rebels and arrest their leaders. He learned that the colonists had a large store of gunpowder and weapons hidden in the town of Concord. On the night of April 18, 1775, he dispatched a force of about 700 British soldiers, or redcoats, to march from Boston to seize the supplies and capture rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The colonists were well prepared for such a move. A network of spies and messengers, including the famous Paul Revere and William Dawes, rode through the countryside to warn that the British were on the march. When the British troops reached the town of Lexington on the morning of April 19th, they were met by about 77 colonial Minutemen assembled on the village green. It is unclear who fired first, but a shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. In the brief, chaotic skirmish that followed, 8 Americans were killed. The British soldiers then marched on to Concord, where they found that most of the military supplies had already been moved. At Concord's North Bridge, they were met by a larger force of colonial militia, and this time, the colonists fired back, forcing the British to retreat. The British retreat back to Boston turned into a nightmare. All along the 16-mile road, thousands of colonial militiamen, hiding behind stone walls, trees, and houses, fired upon the column of marching redcoats. The British, trained for open-field battles, were unprepared for this kind of guerrilla warfare. By the time they staggered back to the safety of Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties, far more than the colonists. The battles of Lexington and Concord were more than just skirmishes. They were the start of the American Revolutionary War. The news spread like wildfire, and within days, thousands of militia from all over New England surrounded Boston, trapping the British Army inside the city. The war had begun. As the war intensified through 1775 and into 1776, the idea of a complete break from Great Britain grew stronger. What had started as a fight for rights within the British Empire was transforming into a war for independence. The Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, had become the de facto government of the colonies, creating a continental army and appointing George Washington as its commander. Yet many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. This sentiment began to change dramatically with the publication of a pamphlet called in early 1776. Written by Thomas Paine, it used simple, powerful language to argue that it was, well, absurd for a huge continent to be ruled by a tiny, distant island, and that the time had come for America to declare its independence. By the summer of 1776, the momentum for independence was, honestly, unstoppable. On July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted in favor of a resolution declaring the colonies free and independent states. The next step was to explain this momentous decision to the world. A committee of 5, including Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and the primary author, Thomas Jefferson, was tasked with drafting a formal declaration. Jefferson, drawing on the Enlightenment ideas of John Locke and other philosophers, penned a document that would become one of the most important statements on human rights in history. The Declaration of Independence was more than just a list of grievances against the king, it was a profound assertion of universal principles. The document's famous second paragraph laid out a revolutionary political philosophy. It began with the self-evident truths that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was a radical departure from the old world of kings and aristocrats, where rights were granted by the powerful. The Declaration argued that rights are inherent and belong to every individual from birth. It went on to state that governments are created to protect these rights and that they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. This simple but powerful idea laid the foundation for modern democracy. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The delegates who signed it knew they were committing an act of treason against the British Crown. They were risking their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. For them, there was no turning back. The Declaration transformed the conflict from a civil war into a war between two separate nations. It was a clear signal to the world, and especially to potential allies like France, that the Americans were not just fighting for better treatment, they were fighting to create a new nation, founded on the groundbreaking ideal that the people themselves should be the masters of their own destiny. The early years of the war were incredibly difficult for the American Continental Army. They were facing the most powerful military force in the world. The British Army was a professional, well-trained and well-equipped institution, supported by the formidable Royal Navy which controlled the seas. In contrast, the American Army under General George Washington was a collection of poorly supplied militia and volunteer soldiers, often serving for short terms. The British had significant advantages, including a larger population, a strong manufacturing base, and the ability to hire foreign mercenaries, such as the German Hessians. The Americans, however, had their own advantages. They were fighting on their home ground. They were motivated by the cause of liberty, and they had a brilliant and resilient leader in Washington. The Battle of Bunker Hill in June of 1775, though technically a British victory, showed the world that the inexperienced American forces could stand up to professional soldiers. The colonists inflicted heavy casualties on the British regulars as they charged up the hill, only retreating when they ran out of ammunition. Later, in the fall of 1775, the Americans launched an ambitious but ultimately failed invasion of Canada, hoping to capture Quebec and persuade French Canadians to join their cause. The brutal winter campaign ended in defeat, a stark reminder of the immense challenges the new nation faced. By late 1776, after being driven out of New York City, the American cause seemed to be on the brink of collapse. Just when morale was at its lowest, General Washington executed a daring and brilliant maneuver that revitalized the American spirit. On Christmas night in 1776, he led his freezing, weary troops across the icy Delaware River for a surprise attack on a garrison of Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. The attack was a stunning success, with nearly the entire Hessian force captured. A few days later, Washington followed up with another victory at the Battle of Princeton. These small but crucial victories were not strategically decisive in a large sense, but they were immense psychological triumphs. They proved that Washington's army could still fight and win, inspiring many soldiers to re-enlist and restoring faith in the revolutionary cause. The true turning point of the war came in the fall of 1777, with the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. The British had devised a complex plan to split the colonies in two by sending an army south from Canada to meet another force moving north from New York City. The plan went awry. The British Army under General John Burgoyne was bogged down in the dense wilderness, harassed by American militia, and eventually surrounded by a superior American force led by General Horatio Gates. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire army. The victory at Saratoga was monumental. It was the first time a large British army had been defeated and captured, proving that the Americans could win the war. The American victory at the Battle of Saratoga had consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. It was the diplomatic breakthrough the United States desperately needed. From the beginning of the war, American diplomats, most notably the clever and charming Benjamin Franklin in Paris, had been trying to persuade France to officially join the war on their side. The French monarchy, a historic rival of Great Britain, had been secretly supplying the Americans with money and weapons, eager to see its old enemy weakened. However, France was hesitant to commit to a full alliance with the fledgling nation until it could prove it had a real chance of winning. Saratoga was that proof. News of the surrender of an entire British army convinced the French government that the American cause was viable. In February of 1778, France formally recognized the United States of America and signed a treaty of alliance. This alliance was a game changer. It transformed the colonial rebellion into a global conflict, forcing Great Britain to fight a war on multiple fronts. The French provided the Americans with exactly what they needed most: a powerful navy, experienced troops, and vast sums of money and supplies. French naval power was crucial because it could challenge the Royal Navy's dominance of the seas, threatening British supply lines and blockades along the American coast. The entry of France into the war also encouraged other European powers to act against Britain. Spain, another rival of Britain with its own colonial interests, declared war in 1779. While Spain did not formally ally with the United States, it fought against the British in the Caribbean, along the Gulf Coast and in Europe, further stretching British military resources. The Netherlands, a major trading nation, also entered the war against Britain, providing crucial loans to the American government. Suddenly, Britain found itself isolated and fighting a world war, defending its possessions in the West Indies, Gibraltar, and even India. The American Revolution had become the centerpiece of a much larger international struggle. The impact of this foreign assistance on the ground in America was immense. French officers like the young and idealistic Marquis de Lafayette served bravely in the Continental Army and became a powerful symbol of the alliance. The presence of French soldiers and ships gave General Washington new strategic options. The war was no longer just about American survival, it was now a coordinated effort to defeat the British military. The alliance gave the Americans the military and financial strength they needed to endure the final years of the war and to set the stage for the decisive final confrontation that would ultimately secure their independence and turn the world upside down. With the power of the French alliance behind them, the Americans were able to force the final decisive chapter of the war. In 1781, the main British army in the South, under the command of Lord Charles Cornwallis, moved into Virginia and established a base at Yorktown, a port city on the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was confident that the British Royal Navy could supply or evacuate his army if necessary. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. General George Washington saw a golden opportunity. He coordinated a complex plan with the French commander, Comte de Rochambeau, to trap Cornwallis's army. Washington secretly marched his combined American and French armies south from New York to Virginia. The key to the entire plan was naval supremacy. A French fleet, under the command of Admiral de Grasse, sailed from the West Indies and defeated the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake. This crucial naval victory cut off Cornwallis from any hope of rescue or reinforcement by sea. Shortly after, Washington's and Rochambeau's land forces arrived and laid siege to Yorktown, completely surrounding the British army. For 3 weeks, the Allied forces bombarded the British positions relentlessly. Pinned down by land and sea, with his defenses crumbling and his supplies dwindling, Lord Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. On October 19, 1781, the British army marched out of its fortifications at Yorktown and laid down its arms. The surrender was a spectacle of immense historical importance. As the British soldiers marched between the lines of American and French troops, a British military band is said to have played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting song for a moment that signaled the birth of a new nation and the defeat of a global superpower. While the surrender at Yorktown did not officially end the war, it was the last major battle. The defeat was so demoralizing that it broke the political will of the British government to continue fighting. Peace negotiations began soon after. The war officially concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. In this treaty, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America. It also granted the new nation vast territories extending from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes down to Florida. The long, arduous struggle was finally over. The colonists had done the unthinkable. They had defeated the most powerful empire on earth and won their freedom. Now they faced an even greater challenge, building a stable, lasting republic based on the ideals for which they had fought so hard. The victory was not an end, but a new beginning. The American Revolution was far more than a military victory. It was a triumph of ideas that would echo for generations and inspire people across the globe. The creation of the United States as a large-scale republic, governed by a written constitution and based on the consent of the governed, was a radical experiment that proved successful. It demonstrated that the philosophical ideals of the Enlightenment were not just abstract theories, but could be the practical foundation for a real government. The American example showed that it was possible to create a society without a king, without a hereditary nobility, and without a state-enforced church, challenging the very structure of European society. The success of the American Revolution provided a powerful and tangible model for other nations striving for change. Less than a decade after the Treaty of Paris, the French Revolution erupted, with revolutionaries there explicitly citing the American struggle for liberty as an inspiration. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen drew heavily on the principles articulated in the American Declaration of Independence. Throughout the 19th century, leaders of independence movements in Latin America, from Simon Bolivar in the South to Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico, looked to the United States as a blueprint for how to break free from European colonial rule and establish independent republics. The revolution's impact also reshaped the concept of democracy itself. While ancient Athens had democracy, it was limited to a small city-state. The United States proved that democratic principles could be applied to a large, diverse, and geographically expansive nation. The ideas of popular sovereignty, individual rights, and the rule of law became central tenets of modern democratic thought. The American Constitution, with its innovative system of checks and balances and separation of powers, became a widely studied model for governments around the world, seeking to balance authority with liberty and prevent the rise of tyranny. The revolution helped launch a global age of democratic revolutions that has continued to this day. Of course, the American Revolution was imperfect. The noble words that all men are created equal did not apply to the hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans, nor did they apply to women or Native Americans. The struggle to live up to the nation's founding ideals would become a central theme of American history itself, leading to conflicts like the Civil War and the ongoing civil rights movement. Yet, the very existence of those ideals provided the moral and legal framework for future generations to demand their rights. The American Revolution did not create a perfect society, but it unleashed a powerful and enduring idea that liberty is a universal right, and that ordinary people have the power to shape their own destiny. That idea truly changed the world.